The sun was shining brightly as Marcus Johnson stepped out of his sleek black car, parked neatly in front of one of the most prestigious banks in the city. Dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, polished leather shoes, and a crisp white shirt, Marcus exuded confidence and professionalism. He had just come from an early morning workout and was on his way to a series of important meetings later that day. But first he needed to stop by the bank to deposit a check, a routine task that should have taken no more than 10 minutes. As he entered the grand glass doors of the bank, the cool air conditioning greeted him, offering relief from the warm, summer heat outside. The lobby was spacious, with marble floors gleaming under soft overhead lights. Customers sat quietly in plush chairs waiting for their turn at the counters, while employees moved about efficiently, attending to various tasks. Everything seemed normal, almost serene. Little did Marcus know, this visit would turn into something far from ordinary. Marcus approached the counter where a young woman named Sarah was stationed. She looked up briefly as he arrived, but quickly returned her gaze to the papers in front of her. Her name tag read Sarah W. in neat block letters. Without much enthusiasm, she asked, "How can I help you today?" Marcus smiled politely and handed over the check he wanted to deposit. "I'd like to deposit this, please," he said, his tone calm and courteous. Sarah glanced at the check and then at Marcus's ID, which he slid across the counter. For a moment, she froze. Her eyes darted between the ID and Marcus's face, lingering longer than necessary. Then, without saying anything, she picked up the ID and held it close to her face, squinting as though trying to detect some flaw or inconsistency. Marcus raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. He was used to people scrutinizing him more closely than others, especially in places like this. Still, there was something about the way Sarah was behaving that felt off. "Is everything okay?" Marcus finally asked when the silence stretched too long. Sarah hesitated before responding. Yes, it's just..." She trailed off, frowning slightly. "Do you mind if I double-check this with my manager, just to make sure everything is in order?" Marcus tilted his head, confused. "Sure, go ahead," he replied, keeping his voice steady despite feeling a growing sense of unease. He watched as Sarah turned away and whispered something to another employee nearby. They both glanced back at him, exchanging looks that made Marcus feel increasingly uncomfortable. What exactly were they discussing? Was there really an issue with his ID or the check? A few moments later, Sarah returned with a clipboard and began asking questions. "So, Mr. Johnson, how did you come by this check?" she asked, her tone clipped and formal. "It's from a client payment," Marcus explained patiently. "It's completely legitimate." Sarah nodded slowly, though her expression remained skeptical. "And do you often handle transactions like this?" Marcus frowned now, sensing that this line of questioning wasn't standard procedure. "I'm not sure why that matters," he said evenly. "But yes, I manage several accounts for personal and business purposes." At this point, other customers waiting in line started to take notice. Some craned their necks to see what was happening, while others exchanged curious glances. A man standing behind Marcus leaned forward slightly, clearly intrigued by the unfolding scene. Marcus could feel the weight of all those eyes on him, and it only added to his frustration. Why was everyone making such a big deal out of a simple deposit? Sarah scribbled something on her clipboard before speaking again. This time, her tone carried a hint of condescension. "You understand, Mr. Johnson? We need to be extra careful with large sums like this. We wouldn't want any misunderstandings." Marcus clenched his jaw but forced himself to stay composed. He knew better than to let his emotions get the best of him in situations like this. Instead, he decided to play along, for now. "Of course," he said smoothly. "I appreciate your diligence, but I assure you there's nothing to worry about." Despite his reassurances, Sarah continued to drag out the process. She inspected the check multiple times, comparing signatures and numbers as though searching for hidden flaws. Each passing minute felt like an eternity to Marcus, who was acutely aware of the clock ticking down to his next appointment. Finally, after what seemed like forever, Sarah announced that she needed to consult with her manager once more. She disappeared behind a door labeled Staff Only, leaving Marcus standing alone at the counter. As he waited, he couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play here. It wasn't the first time he'd encountered resistance in spaces like this, spaces dominated by wealth and privilege. But rarely had it been so blatant. Was it because of the color of his skin? Or maybe his age? Whatever the reason, Marcus knew one thing for certain. This wasn't going to end well unless someone stepped in to set things straight. When Sarah reappeared, she was accompanied by a middle-aged man wearing a suit and tie. His name tag identified him as Greg, the branch manager. Unlike Sarah, Greg carried an air of authority, though his demeanor was equally dismissive. He gave Marcus a cursory glance before turning his attention to the documents spread out on the counter. "Good morning, sir," Greg began, his tone overly polite yet laced with suspicion. "We're just reviewing your transaction to ensure everything is above board. Rest assured we'll resolve this shortly." Marcus nodded stiffly, his patience wearing thin. "Thank you," he replied, though his words lacked warmth. Inside, he was seething. How dare they treat him like a criminal over something as routine as depositing a check? Did they not realize who he was? Or rather, who his family was? Unbeknownst to the bank staff, Marcus was the son of Derek Johnson, one of the wealthiest and most influential CEOs in the country. Derek had built his empire from scratch, transforming a small startup into a global tech giant that partnered with major corporations worldwide, including this very bank. If anyone deserved respect and fair treatment, it was Marcus. Yet here he stood, being humiliated in front of strangers simply because of assumptions based on appearance. As the minutes ticked by, Marcus found himself reflecting on similar experiences he'd faced throughout his life. From being followed around in luxury stores to being overlooked in professional settings, he had grown accustomed to navigating a world that often judged him unfairly. But today's encounter felt different. Today it wasn't just about him. It was about sending a message, and Marcus knew exactly how to deliver it. Just as Greg was about to speak again, the sound of footsteps echoed through the lobby. Heads turned toward the entrance, where a tall figure dressed in a sharp charcoal gray suit had just walked in. His presence commanded immediate attention, and even Greg paused mid-sentence to look. When the man spoke, his deep, commanding voice filled the room. "What seems to be the problem here?" As the tall, commanding figure entered the bank, his deep voice cutting through the tense atmosphere like a blade, all eyes turned toward him. The man exuded authority and confidence, his presence impossible to ignore. Dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit with a tie that matched his piercing gaze, he carried himself with an air of someone who was not only used to being listened to, but also respected without question. It was Derek Johnson, CEO of one of the largest tech companies in the country and, more importantly, Marcus's father. Derek's arrival was unexpected, even for Marcus. He had no idea his dad would be anywhere near this part of town today. But as Derek strode into the lobby, his sharp eyes immediately locked onto his son standing at the counter. The look on Marcus's face said it all. Something was wrong. Derek didn't need words to understand that his son was caught up in an uncomfortable situation. His jaw tightened slightly as he approached the counter, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor with each purposeful step. Greg, the branch manager, froze mid-sentence when he saw Derek. For a moment, confusion flickered across his face. He clearly recognized the billionaire CEO from news articles and corporate events. But then reality hit him like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just any customer. This was the Derek Johnson. The same Derek Johnson whose company partnered with banks like theirs to handle billions in transactions annually, and now here he was, witnessing firsthand how his employees were treating his own flesh and blood. "Mr. Johnson," Greg stammered, trying to recover his composure. What brings you here today?" Derek ignored the question for a moment, choosing instead to focus on his son. "Marcus," he said evenly, his tone calm but firm, "tell me what's going on." Marcus hesitated, glancing briefly at Sarah, who looked pale and visibly shaken, before turning back to his father. "It's nothing major, Dad," he began, though his tone betrayed otherwise. "I came in to deposit a check and—" He trailed off, unsure whether to downplay the incident or lay it all out there. But Derek didn't give him a chance to decide. "It doesn't sound like nothing major if you're still standing here after 20 minutes, Derek interrupted, his voice steady but laced with quiet fury. He turned his attention to Greg and Sarah, his piercing gaze pinning them in place. "Would someone care to explain why my son has been treated so poorly?" The room fell silent. Customers seated nearby leaned forward slightly, eager to catch every word of the unfolding drama. Even the tellers behind their counters stopped typing on their keyboards, curiosity getting the better of them. Everyone could sense that this wasn't just a routine complaint. It was about to become a spectacle. Sarah, trembling under Derek's scrutiny, tried to speak first. "Sir, we were just following protocol," she said weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. "We needed to verify the authenticity of the check and ensure everything was in order." "In order?" Derek repeated, raising an eyebrow. His tone was deceptively calm, but the edge beneath it was unmistakable. "And how many other customers have you subjected to this level of scrutiny today? Or is my son the only one who requires such thorough attention?" Sarah opened her mouth to respond but found herself unable to form coherent words. Instead, she glanced helplessly at Greg, silently pleading for him to intervene. Greg cleared his throat nervously, stepping forward to address Derek directly. "Mr. Johnson, please allow me to assure you that we take these matters very seriously," Greg began, his voice strained as he struggled to maintain professionalism. "Our priority is always the security of our clients' accounts. In this case, we simply wanted to confirm—" "To confirm what exactly?" Derek cut him off sharply. "That my son isn't capable of handling his own finances? That he somehow doesn't belong in a place like this?" He gestured around the opulent lobby, his expression unyielding. "Let me make something crystal clear. Marcus is not only fully capable of managing his affairs, but he's also the beneficiary of a trust fund larger than most people will ever see in their lifetimes. So forgive me if I find your so-called protocol hard to believe." The weight of Derek's words hung heavily in the air. Greg's face flushed red, a mixture of embarrassment and panic washing over him. He shot a desperate glance at Sarah, silently urging her to say something, anything, that might defuse the situation. But Sarah was frozen, tears welling up in her eyes as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. Meanwhile, Marcus stood quietly beside his father, watching the exchange unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and unease. On one hand, he couldn't deny feeling vindicated seeing the staff squirm under Derek's interrogation. On the other hand, he hated drawing attention to himself, especially in public settings like this. Still, he knew better than to interrupt his father when he was in full swing. Derek continued, his voice rising slightly as he pressed his point home. "Do you know what happens when businesses treat people unfairly because of their race or background?" he asked, his tone dripping with disdain. "They lose credibility, they lose partnerships, and most importantly, they lose customers. Do you really think I'd continue doing business with a bank that allows discrimination to happen right under its roof?" At this, Greg practically recoiled. "Mr. Johnson, I assure you, this isn't standard practice," he insisted, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. "This is an isolated incident and we'll do whatever it takes to rectify the situation." "Isolated incident?" Derek echoed, his voice dangerously low. "You mean like the time your teller followed me around the branch 3 years ago because she thought I might steal something? Or the time your loan officer suggested I wouldn't qualify for a mortgage despite having a credit score higher than 800? He shook his head, his expression a mix of disappointment and anger. "Don't insult my intelligence by pretending this hasn't happened before." By now, whispers had spread throughout the lobby. Some customers nodded approvingly, clearly, siding with Derek and Marcus. Others exchanged sympathetic looks while a few discreetly pulled out their phones to capture the moment. The tension in the room was palpable, and it was clear that the bank staff had dug themselves into a hole they couldn't easily climb out of. Sarah finally broke her silence, her voice trembling as she spoke. I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson," she choked out, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I didn't mean to offend anyone. I was trying to follow the rules." Derek studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without saying another word, he turned back to Greg. "I expect a full report on my desk by tomorrow morning detailing how you plan to address this issue, not just for today, but moving forward. If I don't see meaningful change within the next month, consider our partnership terminated." Greg nodded frantically, beads of sweat now trickling down his temples. "Absolutely, Mr. Johnson. You have my word." With that, Derek placed a reassuring hand on Marcus's shoulder and motioned for him to follow. As they walked away from the counter, the entire bank seemed to hold its breath. No one dared to speak until the pair had disappeared through the glass doors, leaving behind a scene of chaos and shame. Once outside, Marcus let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. "Thanks, Dad," he said quietly. "But I hate making scenes like that." Derek gave him a small, understanding smile. "Sometimes, son, scenes are necessary. People won't learn unless they're forced to confront their mistakes. Today wasn't just about us, it was about sending a message." Marcus nodded slowly, appreciating his father's wisdom. Though the encounter had been frustrating, he couldn't deny feeling a sense of pride knowing they'd stood up for themselves, and for others who might face similar treatment in the future. As they climbed into the car together, Marcus glanced back at the bank one last time. The memory of the day would stay with him forever, but so too would the lesson it taught. Standing up against injustice was never easy, but it was always worth it. As Marcus and Derek stepped out of the bank, the tension that had built up inside seemed to dissipate slightly with the fresh air. The sun was still shining brightly, casting long shadows across the pavement. But neither father nor son felt fully at ease yet. The confrontation they had just endured weighed heavily on their minds, though they handled it with grace and composure. Still, Derek knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Before climbing into the car, Derek paused for a moment, glancing back at the bank's towering glass doors. His expression hardened as he thought about what had transpired inside. It wasn't just about Sarah or Greg. It was about a system that allowed such discrimination to persist unchecked. For years, Derek had worked tirelessly to build his empire, breaking barriers and shattering stereotypes along the way. Yet moments like this reminded him how far society still had to go before true equality could be achieved. "Dad," Marcus began hesitantly, sensing his father's deepening frustration. "What are you thinking?" Derek turned to face his son, his features softening slightly. "I'm thinking about accountability," he replied, his voice steady but firm. "This isn't just about us walking away feeling vindicated. It's about making sure something like this never happens, again, to anyone." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding exactly where his father was coming from. Growing up as the son of one of the most successful black entrepreneurs in the country, he'd faced his share of prejudice and bias. But unlike many others who might not have the resources or platform to fight back, Marcus had always known he could rely on his father's influence to make a difference. And today, Derek intended to use that influence to its fullest extent. Without another word, Derek opened the car door and slid into the driver's seat, gesturing for Marcus to join him. Once both were settled, Derek pulled out his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. On the other end of the line, his personal assistant picked up almost instantly. "Linda, it's me," Derek said briskly. "I need you to get in touch with our legal team immediately. We're drafting a formal complaint against that bank we visited earlier, the one downtown. I want every detail documented. Names, timestamps, everything. Also, reach out to their regional director. I expect a meeting scheduled within 24 hours." Marcus listened quietly as his father issued instructions, impressed by his efficiency and determination. Though Derek rarely raised his voice or lost his temper, there was no mistaking the intensity behind his words. When it came to matters of justice, especially those involving his family. Derek didn't play games. He played to win. After hanging up, Derek turned to Marcus with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think I'm being too harsh?" he asked, surprising his son. "Some people might say I'm overreacting." Marcus shook his head firmly. "No, Dad. You're doing what needs to be done. If anything, I wish more people would stand up the way you do. This isn't just about us. It's about setting an example." Derek smiled faintly, pride flickering in his eyes. "You've always understood the bigger picture, haven't you? That's why I know you'll carry the torch when I'm gone." The comment caught Marcus off guard, and for a moment he didn't know how to respond. Instead, he focused on the road ahead. As Derek started the engine and pulled away from the curb, the drive home was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts, but the unspoken bond between them remained strong. Meanwhile, back at the bank, chaos reigned supreme. After Derek and Marcus left, the staff scrambled to figure out their next move. Customers lingered longer than usual, whispering amongst themselves about what they had witnessed. Some expressed outrage at the treatment Marcus had received, while others admitted they weren't surprised given the bank's reputation for elitism. One elderly woman even approached Greg, wagging her finger at him. "You should be ashamed of yourselves," she scolded. "That poor young man didn't deserve to be treated like a criminal. If I were you, I'd start apologizing, and fast." Greg, already sweating profusely, managed a weak nod. "Yes, ma'am. We're handling it." But handling. It was easier said than done. Within minutes of Derek's departure, news of the incident began spreading like wildfire, first among employees, then to higher-ups within the bank's corporate structure. By the time the regional director arrived 2 hours later, the entire branch was in disarray. Papers were scattered across desks, phones rang nonstop, and several customers had already canceled appointments or closed accounts in protest. When the regional director, a middle-aged woman named Patricia Langley, walked into the lobby, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Known for her no-nonsense attitude and razor-sharp business acumen, Patricia wasted no time getting to the bottom of things. She called an emergency meeting in the staff break room, demanding answers from everyone involved. "What in God's name happened here?" Patricia demanded, slamming a folder onto the table. Her sharp eyes scanned the room, landing first on Greg, then Sarah, both of whom looked as though they'd rather disappear than explain themselves. Greg cleared his throat, nervously. "Ms. Langley, we were simply following standard verification procedures," he began, his voice trembling. "There was a concern about the legitimacy of the check, so we—" "A concern?" Patricia interrupted sharply. "Or a prejudiced assumption based on someone's skin color?" The room fell silent. No one dared to breathe as Patricia leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Let me remind you all that this bank prides itself on inclusivity and professionalism. What happened today was neither. Not only did you embarrass yourselves, but you also potentially jeopardized millions in partnerships. Do you have any idea who Derek Johnson is?" Sarah, tears streaming down her face once again, shook her head mutely. Patricia sighed heavily, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Mr. Johnson is one of the wealthiest and most influential CEOs in the world. His company processes billions of dollars worth of transactions annually, and guess which banks handle those funds? Ours. Now, thanks to your incompetence, we're teetering on the brink of losing that partnership." The gravity of the situation hit everyone like a ton of bricks. Even Greg, who prided himself on his ability to navigate tricky scenarios, looked utterly defeated. "We'll fix it," he promised, though his voice lacked conviction. "Whatever it takes." Patricia stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You'd better," she snapped, "because if Mr. Johnson decides to sever ties with us, heads will roll, including mine. Get yourselves together and prepare for damage control, starting now." With that, she stormed out of the room, leaving the staff to pick up the pieces. As they dispersed, whispers filled the air, each employee grappling with guilt, fear, and regret. For Sarah, the weight of her actions was unbearable. She slumped into a chair, burying her face in her hands, wondering how she could possibly make amends for the harm she'd caused. Back at the Johnson residence, Derek and Marcus sat in the living room discussing their next steps. Though the day's events had been emotionally draining, neither felt ready to let it go just yet. They agreed that filing a formal complaint was necessary, but Derek wanted to take it a step further. "I'm going to demand mandatory diversity training for all employees," Derek announced, tapping his pen against a notepad. "And not just some half-hearted seminar. They need workshops, role-playing exercises, real accountability measures. Otherwise, nothing changes." Marcus nodded approvingly. "That's a good idea. Maybe bring in experts who can address unconscious bias and systemic racism. People need to understand why this kind of behavior is unacceptable." Derek smiled faintly, proud of his son's insight. "Exactly. And we'll monitor their progress closely. If they don't show improvement, we'll pull our business entirely. Sometimes tough love is the only language corporations understand." As they continued planning, a sense of purpose washed over them. Yes, the day had been difficult, but it had also reinforced their commitment to creating meaningful change. Discrimination wasn't something they took lightly, and thanks to Derek's influence, the bank was about to learn that lesson the hard way. By evening, news outlets had caught wind of the story, and social media buzzed with reactions. Hashtags like #Justice for Marcus and #Accountability in Action trended nationwide, sparking debates about racial bias in financial institutions. Supporters praised Derek and Marcus for standing up, while critics accused them of making a mountain out of a molehill. Through it all, the Johnsons remained steadfast, knowing their actions would inspire others to speak out against injustice. As Marcus lay in bed that night, replaying the day's events in his mind, he couldn't help but feel hopeful. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but every step forward mattered. And thanks to his father's leadership, they had taken a giant leap toward a brighter, fairer future. The next morning, the bank's downtown branch opened its doors as usual, but the atmosphere was anything but normal. Employees moved about with hushed urgency, their faces etched with anxiety. The previous day's confrontation had left a deep scar, and everyone knew that today would be a turning point, for better or worse. News of Derek Johnson's threat to sever ties with the bank had reached every corner of the organization, sending shockwaves through the corporate hierarchy. For a financial institution that prided itself on exclusivity and prestige, losing such a high-profile partnership would be catastrophic. By 9 a.m., Patricia Langley, the regional director, arrived at the branch accompanied by 2 members of the bank's senior leadership team. They carried themselves with an air of authority, but their expressions betrayed the pressure they were under. Patricia immediately called another emergency meeting in the conference room, this time including not only the staff involved in the incident, but also representatives from human resources and public relations. The stakes were higher than ever, and the clock was ticking. "All right, listen up," Patricia began, her voice firm and commanding. "We've got less than 24 hours before Mr. Johnson expects a detailed plan for addressing yesterday's events. That means we need solutions, real ones, not excuses or half measures. This is our chance to prove that we're serious about change." One of the HR representatives raised his hand hesitantly. "Ms. Langley, I understand the urgency, but implementing meaningful reforms takes time. We can't just overhaul decades of institutional culture overnight." Patricia fixed him with a steely glare. "Then you'd better start working miracles, because if we don't show progress, we're toast. Mr. Johnson isn't someone who tolerates empty promises." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the gravity of her words. It was clear that this wasn't just about placating a disgruntled customer, it was about survival. The bank's reputation, partnerships, and bottom line were all on the line, and no one wanted to bear the blame if things went south. Meanwhile, Derek Johnson was already several steps ahead. Early that morning, he had convened a virtual meeting with his legal team, PR advisors, and key executives from his company. Together, they crafted a comprehensive strategy to hold the bank accountable while pushing for systemic change. Derek didn't want revenge, he wanted reform. He saw this moment as an opportunity to shine a light on issues that often remained hidden behind closed doors. "We're going to make this a teachable moment, for them and for everyone watching," Derek declared during the meeting. "I Want our demands to include mandatory diversity training, regular audits of discriminatory practices, and transparent reporting on their progress. If they refuse to comply, we'll take our business elsewhere and make sure the world knows why." His team nodded in agreement, impressed by his vision. One of the PR advisors chimed in, "This could go viral in a good way. People respect leaders who stand up against injustice. With the right messaging, we can turn this into a movement." Derek smiled faintly, appreciating the compliment but staying focused on the task at hand. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Our priority is ensuring that what happened to Marcus doesn't happen to anyone else. Everything else will follow." As the meeting wrapped up, Derek turned his attention to preparing for the face-to-face discussion with the bank's leadership. He knew it wouldn't be easy. They'd likely try to smooth things over with apologies and vague promises, but he was determined to leave no room for ambiguity. Change required accountability, and Derek intended to hold them to the highest standards. At 11:30 a.m., the much-anticipated meeting took place in a private conference room at the bank's headquarters. Derek walked in, flanked by Marcus and 2 members of his legal team, exuding confidence and authority. Across the table sat Patricia Langley, Greg, Sarah, and several other senior officials, their faces tense with apprehension. The contrast between the two groups couldn't have been starker. Derek and his team radiated purpose, while the bank's representatives appeared defensive and uncertain. Patricia opened the meeting with a heartfelt apology. "Mr. Johnson, allow me to extend my sincerest regrets for the treatment your son received yesterday. What happened was unacceptable, and I assure you, it does not reflect the values of our institution." Derek listened patiently, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he leaned forward slightly, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. "Thank you for your apology, Ms. Langley, but actions speak louder than words. My son endured blatant discrimination, not because of any wrongdoing, but because of assumptions based on his race. That's not something a simple sorry can fix." Patricia nodded solemnly. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Johnson, which is why we've already begun drafting a comprehensive action plan to address these issues. We're committed to creating a more inclusive environment moving forward." Greg, visibly nervous, added, "We've scheduled mandatory diversity training sessions for all employees starting next week. Additionally, we're implementing stricter protocols to prevent similar incidents in the future." Derek arched an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Training sessions are a good start, but they're not enough. You need measurable goals, transparency, and accountability. I want quarterly reports detailing your progress, along with independent audits to ensure compliance. And let's be clear, if I see even a hint of backsliding, our partnership ends immediately." The room grew quiet as the weight of his ultimatum sank in. No one dared argue. They knew Derek meant every word. Patricia exchanged uneasy glances with her colleagues before responding. "Understood, Mr. Johnson. We'll provide the reports and welcome external oversight. Your satisfaction is our top priority." Marcus, sitting quietly beside his father, watched the exchange with a mix of pride and determination. Though he preferred to avoid conflict, he admired his father's unwavering commitment to justice. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about setting a precedent for how institutions should respond to discrimination. After nearly 2 hours of intense negotiation, the meeting concluded with a tentative agreement. The bank agreed to implement Derek's proposed reforms, including mandatory diversity training, quarterly progress reports, and independent audits. In return, Derek agreed to give them 6 months to demonstrate tangible improvements. If they failed to deliver, he made it clear that he wouldn't hesitate to sever ties permanently. As they left the building, Marcus turned to his father. "Do you think they'll actually follow through?" Derek placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "They don't have a choice. Their survival depends on it. But more importantly, this sends a message to other companies. Treating people unfairly has consequences. Today we stood up not just for ourselves, but for everyone who's ever been mistreated because of their race or background." Marcus nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Though the road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, he knew they were making a difference, one step at a time. Back at the bank, the mood remained somber. Employees gathered in small groups discussing the implications of the meeting and what it meant for their jobs. Some expressed relief that the immediate crisis had been averted, while others worried about the long-term impact of the reforms. Sarah, still reeling from guilt and shame, approached Greg after the meeting ended. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I never meant for any of this to happen." Greg sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "I know, Sarah, but intentions don't matter when the outcome is this disastrous. What matters now is learning from our mistakes and doing better. Let's hope this experience teaches us all something valuable." As the day drew to a close, news outlets continued to cover the story, amplifying calls for greater accountability in corporate America. Social media buzzed with support for Derek and Marcus, with many praising their courage and leadership. For the Johnsons, the battle wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while they felt hopeful. Change was possible, and they were leading the charge. In the weeks that followed the confrontation at the bank, the story of Marcus Johnson and his father Derek became a catalyst for change, not just within the financial institution but across industries nationwide. The incident had sparked conversations about racial bias, systemic discrimination, and corporate accountability, thrusting these issues into the spotlight. What began as a personal affront to one man quickly evolved into a movement championed by many. Derek wasted no time ensuring that the promises made by the bank were kept. Within days of the meeting, independent auditors were brought in to assess the branch's policies and practices. Employees underwent intensive diversity training sessions led by experts in unconscious bias and inclusive leadership. Flyers promoting inclusivity were posted throughout the building, and new protocols were implemented to prevent similar incidents in the future. But Derek wasn't satisfied with surface-level changes. He demanded transparency and measurable progress. Every quarter, the bank submitted detailed reports to Derek's team, outlining their efforts to create a more equitable environment. These reports included statistics on customer complaints related to discrimination, employee feedback from surveys, and evaluations of the training program's effectiveness. Independent auditors reviewed the data, providing an objective assessment of whether the bank was meeting its goals. While some progress was evident, it was clear that transforming decades-old institutional culture would take time and sustained effort. For Sarah, the teller whose actions had ignited the controversy, the aftermath was both humbling and transformative. Initially devastated by her role in the incident, she feared losing her job, or worse, being labeled as prejudiced for life. However, Derek insisted that punishment wasn't the goal. Education and growth were. Under the guidance of HR, Sarah participated in additional workshops designed to help employees recognize and address their biases. She also shadowed colleagues who excelled at delivering exceptional customer service, learning firsthand how to treat every client with dignity and respect. Over time, Sarah began to rebuild her confidence and her reputation. During one particularly impactful training session, she shared her experience openly, admitting her mistakes and expressing her commitment to doing better. Her honesty resonated with others, sparking candid discussions about the challenges of overcoming implicit biases. By the end of the 6-month probationary period, Sarah had become one of the most vocal advocates for change within the branch, mentoring newer employees and serving on a committee tasked with developing long-term diversity initiatives. Greg, the branch manager, faced a steeper climb. Though he hadn't directly discriminated against Marcus, his failure to intervene sooner had allowed the situation to escalate. Recognizing this, Greg threw himself into improving the branch's operations, working closely with senior leadership to implement reforms. He attended leadership seminars focused on fostering inclusive environments and sought feedback from employees and customers alike. Slowly but surely, he earned back some measure of trust, not through grand gestures but through consistent, meaningful action. Meanwhile, outside the bank, the ripple effects of Derek's intervention continued to spread. News outlets covered the story extensively, highlighting the Johnsons' determination to turn a painful moment into an opportunity for growth. Social media played a pivotal role, amplifying calls for greater accountability in corporate America. Hashtags like "No to Discrimination" and "Fairness" At Work trended globally, inspiring countless individuals to share their own experiences of bias and demand change. Inspired by the public response, Derek decided to expand his efforts beyond the banking sector. He launched a foundation dedicated to combating systemic racism and promoting workplace equity. The foundation funded research on discriminatory practices, provided grants to organizations fighting for social justice, and hosted annual conferences where business leaders could learn from experts and each other. Through these initiatives, Derek ensured that the lessons learned from his family's ordeal wouldn't fade once the headlines did. They would endure as a blueprint for lasting transformation. Marcus, too, found himself profoundly affected by the events. Though he had always been aware of the challenges faced by marginalized communities, this experience deepened his resolve to use his privilege and platform for good. He began volunteering with youth mentorship programs, speaking to young people about navigating prejudice and staying true to themselves despite adversity. At work, he advocated for policies that prioritize diversity and inclusion, earning praise from colleagues and superiors alike. One evening, as father and son sat together in their living room reflecting on everything that had transpired, Marcus turned to Derek with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think we made a difference?" he asked softly. Derek smiled, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "We've already made a difference," he replied. "But the real question is, will we keep making one? Change isn't something you achieve overnight. It's something you fight for every single day." Marcus nodded, understanding the weight of his father's words. They had weathered a storm together, emerging stronger and more united than ever. And while the journey ahead promised to be challenging, they faced it with hope, knowing that even small victories could inspire monumental shifts. As months turned into years, the impact of their actions became undeniable. The bank not only retained its partnership with Derek's company, but also emerged as a leader in promoting workplace equality. Other corporations followed suit, adopting similar reforms and holding themselves accountable for fostering inclusive environments. Conversations about race and bias entered mainstream discourse, encouraging individuals and institutions alike to examine their roles in perpetuating or dismantling systems of oppression. Looking back, Marcus often marveled at how a seemingly ordinary trip to the bank had transformed into a defining chapter in their lives. It reminded him of a lesson his father had instilled in him from a young age. When life gives you lemons, don't just make lemonade. Use them to plant a tree. In standing up against injustice, they hadn't merely addressed a wrong. They had planted seeds of change that would continue to grow for generations to come. And so, as the sun set on another day, casting golden hues across the horizon, Marcus and Derek shared a quiet moment of gratitude. They knew the road to true equality was long and winding, but they also knew they weren't walking it alone. Together, with courage, resilience, and unwavering determination, they were paving the way for a brighter, fairer future.